Okay, so I want to thank Jake Roberts yet again for joining us today. So
Thanks,
today,
Joe.
thanks for coming, Jake. So today we're going to discuss his new book, The Keys of the Rosy Cross and the Ghosts of Bacon. A book I highly recommend, so you can get that on Amazon.
Ah, thank you.
Yes, so please pick that up at Amazon.
It's also available on Barnes and Noble.
And,
So,
okay,
yep.
and do you also have a website that you can get it on?
I do, and the link will just take you to one of those.
Okay.
So it's easier just to go directly to either Amazon or Barnes and Noble. Thanks for that, Joe.
Yep.
But the website is theghostsofbacon.com.
Okay, right. Okay, yep. So the first question: why the title, "The Keys of the Rosy Cross and the Ghosts of Bacon"?
Oh, what a great question. Well, honestly, it actually came from a decryption I uncovered in my first book, the Holy Trinity decryption. And it had to do with a certain individual. In those of you who aren't aware, my first book was, I'll show you the cover, was about this plaque on Shakespeare's monument. And it includes a couple of different types of ciphers. There are 5 different transposition ciphers hidden within that plaque. And there's also Bacon's very famous biliteral cipher. If you're not familiar with his biliteral cipher, the biliteral cipher is basically the forerunner of modern day computer language, right? It's based on 2 different typefaces. And when you have a combination of 5 letters in a row with a combination of the different typefaces, it indicates a different letter of the 24 letter alphabet, the Elizabethan alphabet, 24 letters in it. And so when I decrypted that, the message stated, explain keys of RC, or explain RC keys with look or see Walter Raleigh, was the gist of the message. So Walter Raleigh became one of the keys of understanding the Rosy Cross. And once I started following those clues on Raleigh, that's when I discovered all of this new information that appears in this next book about the very close relationship between the man who we've come to know in history as Walter Raleigh and also Sir Francis Bacon. These guys were the Rosy Cross. They are the keys of the Rosy Cross.
Okay, and I believe we touched on it a little bit in our previous interview, but could you explain what the Rosy Cross is, or who the Rosicrucians were?
Absolutely, and there's a lot of information out there that's based on more modern thinking, and honestly, in my opinion, wishful thinking of who the Rosicrucians really were. There is in modern day Freemasonry, there's a degree of the Rosy Cross. It's been incorporated into modern Freemasonry. However, at its inception, based on my research, the members of the fraternity of the Rosy Cross were simply Francis Bacon, Walter Raleigh, and Sir Francis Drake.
Okay,
And so, what's that?
The famous privateer pirate.
Absolutely, and so as I started uncovering all of this information, I discovered that Francis Bacon and Walter Raleigh both had sailed with Drake and had he basically taught them the ropes, figuratively and literally. And so and these are things that were not publicly known or known in Orthodox history about Sir Francis Bacon. No one knew that he had this very huge nautical background, and it was one of his best kept secrets because he used various aliases to be a privateer, actually. So all of this information is completely new and unknown. And I spent a great deal of time as before we came on, we started to talk about this a little bit, but at the very beginning of my book, I spent a great deal of time discussing how I like to use the word now disbelievable this information is in terms of what we think we know about Orthodox history. And so far, I haven't caught a lot of flack for the information that appears in here, but the problem is that it's so new and so shocking that when I discovered it while writing the first book, particularly the truth about the relationship between Raleigh and Bacon, I kept it to myself because in the first book there are some real bombshells, such as Bacon stating that his best alias wasn't Shakespeare at all. It was Samuel de Champlain. And so a lot of people, obviously, you say something like this, and here we have this huge historical figure who, frankly, appears out of nowhere, right? Just like all of the other Bacon aliases and Raleigh aliases. As you go through my book, I have an entire chapter dedicated to their aliases, and a couple of chapters devoted to individual specific ones. And so once you start looking at these figures and you look at their historical backgrounds, every time you go to a biographical website for one of these people, it says not much is known about the childhood of so-and-so. They all start out exactly the same way, and then they all have a mysterious death of some kind.
Yeah.
And so these people appear larger than life figures in history. They appear out of nowhere, and then they die mysteriously. And so
there is no specific birth date for these people.
No. And that's the funny thing about Sir Walter Raleigh. Ben Jonson famously stated that all of the best minds in London were involved in the creation of the history of Walter Raleigh. Why, if this historical figure, if that's his real name and his true heritage, why did the best minds have to create his history? Mm-hmm. The fact is, he had been, living as someone else, and my research indicates that it was none other than Anthony Bacon, which becomes problematic later in life, right? Because they were both involved on opposite sides of the Essex Rebellion. Those of you who don't know, Robert Devereux, the second Earl of Essex, my research indicates he was actually the son of Queen Elizabeth I. And there was a rivalry between Walter Raleigh and Essex. Meanwhile, Anthony Bacon was also Essex's secretary. And so what happened was Anthony Bacon disappeared into the continent, Europe, early on, doing intelligence work for the Queen. His mother, Lady Anne Bacon, had written to him saying that the Queen was displeased because he hadn't been at court. She missed him and he needed to make an appearance. A little while later, all of a sudden, Sir Walter Raleigh rises to the fore as one of the favorites at court. Mm-hmm. And so, these things are as you track them historically, everything tracks. But one of the things that they did was they would also pass off their aliases to others sometimes. Walter Raleigh had done this a few times. And so I believe that the man who was Essex's secretary was not the original Anthony Bacon who left for Europe. He was the one that returned from Europe after, I think it was 12 years had gone by. So, okay. So, it's really kind of interesting the way all of that kind of played out. And all of this is based upon very, specific messages I decrypted. And it's, when I say that, most people kind of roll their eyes. You talk about decryptions and cipher work. Mm-hmm. But, the very famous cryptologists, Elizabeth and William Friedman. William Friedman was responsible for the creation of the NSA here in the United States. They referred to cipher work when it's properly handled, and that's the key here, when it's properly handled, as being the bedrock of evidence. So what I did was I just followed their advice. They had written at length on how to do certain kinds of decryptions, and how to go about it, and the proper scientific procedures to use. And so that's the way I approached it, was instead of setting out to prove a theory, I just followed the clues where they led me. And this is the information that unfolded. And so as the keys of the Rosy Cross, Bacon and Raleigh were actually, I discovered in my first book, I lay out all of the corroborating evidence and the decryptions to explain how I discovered that Francis Bacon was actually the son of Mary, Queen of Scots, and Francis II. Mm-hmm. And so along with those messages were other curious phrases where Bacon referred to Raleigh as mio gemelli and conati. These are Latin terms that mean twin. And so I didn't want to touch that with a 10-foot pole, because not only am I saying that Francis Bacon was the son of Mary, Queen of Scots, and Francis II, but now I discovered that he had a younger twin named Walter. And that is the man that has come to be known in history as Walter Raleigh. So And I know all of the reasons why this is not supposed to be true according to Orthodox history. Before people spam your channel with replies and comments down below. Yes, I know all of the reasons why. However, no one knows the exact birth date of Walter Raleigh, except they do know that it was January 22nd, the same birthday as Francis Bacon. Okay, but they don't know the year. All of the years are guesstimates based upon a couple of portraits that were painted of Walter Raleigh. And as it turns out, Francis Bacon was the one who painted those portraits. And the age and the date appearing in the right-hand corner, as it turns out, they're not ages or dates at all. They're cipher signatures. And I spent a great deal of time explaining that in my book, The Keys of the Rosy Cross.
An example of that, too, is the funeral monument, right?
Yes.
The death age of 53. It should be 52, 51, 52, but it's 53.
53. And scholars explain that away, and they say, well, he was in his 53rd year. Okay, he was 52 years old, but they're saying he was in his 53rd year, going on 53. So that, that really doesn't hold a lot of water. And the interesting thing is that that date and his age were the keys for decrypting that plaque, and so that's why it was wrong. It was, a mistake. Whenever you see mistakes, they're clues of what to look for next, right? And so they're not mistakes at all. They mean something. And so by following that clue and pulling on that thread a little bit, I was able to discover the keys of the transposition cipher that allowed me to set up the algorithm that rearranged all of the characters of the plaque into a transposition table. And suddenly, as soon as you do that, you start seeing the messages appear.
And then just to put a bow on it, so and then the ghosts of Bacon, those are the multiple aliases of Bacon.
Yes.
and Sir Walter Raleigh.
Yes, and that's where I got the name of my website, as well as my Facebook group and my podcast, The Ghosts of Bacon. It's a riff on after Bacon's philosophical death at the age of 65. And by the way, I tell you who he actually lived as after that, along with Raleigh. But yeah, there was a book published called what was it? Manus Barulamani, right? Which means the shades of Verulam. Verulam, of course, was Bacon's title bestowed upon him by James I, his younger half brother. And so, shades of Verulam means shades, means ghosts. And so I just riffed on that and called them the Ghosts of Bacon, because all of these characters keep appearing throughout history, and then they disappear. So like ghosts. And so, thinking of these guys as being spies or spooks, if you will, we look at the symbolism of this idea of these people entering history and then exiting, it's really pretty interesting the way it also ties in with that famous line from Shakespeare. When you have all the world's a stage, and that's exactly how they were treating the world. They were going out there live action role playing as these fictional people that they created, right? Actors, and they had very good chops from practicing on the Globe Theater stage. So this is what they were doing, and affecting history to a far greater degree than anyone actually realizes. One of the very first aliases whose names appear in my first book was a guy I had never even heard of, and yet here's the name. So I pull the name out, and it was Tiberio Tinelli. Bacon states in the ciphertext, Tiberio Tinelli, that was good, but my best alias was Samuel de Champlain. My jaw dropped. And I'm like, I've never heard of this person. So I go and I look it up, and sure enough, here he is, a famous Renaissance artist. And so I start looking at his artwork, and I was able to find a portrait of a young doctor that Tinelli had painted in Germany, and it's none other than his nephew Watt Raleigh. And I was able to identify text within it, decrypted the ciphers that were actually encrypted within the painting itself, naming this young doctor as Walter Raleigh's son Watt. And again, this was after Watt Raleigh was supposed to have died on Orinoco in that battle, that skirmish with the Spanish. back then it was very easy to fake a death. And here you had Walter Raleigh in command of the small fleet and under orders not to attack the Spanish. And then his best friend and the son go ahead and they attack the Spanish, right? So they committed treason against their king. And Raleigh, of course, knew exactly what that meant because he knew his neck literally was on the line here. And so he told them both, okay, listen, you both just died. I'm going to put you on this ship, Watt, and his friend is going to go over on this other ship, and you have new names now, and keep your head down. And so all he had to do was go back and tell James, yeah, my son and my best friend. My son was killed in the skirmish, and my best friend was so grieved that I wouldn't forgive him that he committed suicide. And that's the story, and there's no way to fact check it. There's no way to, confirm it and verify. So, obviously he was not going to allow his son to, face that kind of justice or his best friend. So that's how that played out.
Yeah. And we'll go into a little bit more of Watt and Sir Walter Raleigh. So how many, well, actually, I'll take a step back. Did the Freedmans have a particular book that you gleaned a lot of your learning from?
Yeah, actually, it was the book where they debunked. It has a very long title, but it was basically they debunked all of the Shakespeare ciphers. Right, a lot of writers at the turn of the 20th century had claimed that they had found ciphers encrypted within the first folio. Unfortunately, no one else could repeat any of their findings. It wasn't repeatable, and the Freedmans went through. This was actually where the Freedmans originally met. Elizabeth Smith, when she met William Friedman, they were both working at Riverside Laboratories, which was a think tank, and this eccentric millionaire put together to try to identify, any kind of decryptions in Shakespeare, as well as lots of other, different projects. And William Friedman originally went there as an expert on plants, right? And so, but then he met Elizabeth and saw what they were doing in trying to decrypt these supposed ciphers in the first folio, and became very interested. And they discovered that he had an incredible natural talent for decryption. And so this is where these two met. They fell in love, and they met over originally trying to decrypt Baconian ciphers. And so when they retired after World Wars I and II were over, because they basically helped the Allies win both wars by doing their decryptions, they returned to it, and they went through and they reviewed all the work from Orville. Ward Owen, I think his name was, Ignatius Donnelly, Elizabeth Wells Gallup, and all of the others. And the problem with the Freedmans, though, is, they soundly debunked some very, very shoddy cryptology work. And it was bad. And unfortunately, that's where today most people have their notions, is from this original work that Francis Bacon was the secret son of Queen Elizabeth I. And people still hold to that theory. I mean, that was actually my preferred theory when I started doing this. I wanted to see if I could find any kind of corroboration for that. And what I ended up doing, unfortunately, was disproving it. But again, in their book, in their analysis, they talk about, this is why this doesn't work. This is why this is wrong. You don't do this type of thing. And so they also had a series of, William Friedman had a series of lectures that are actually published online on the CIA website. And so I went through and I read those on how to do a proper decryption of this type of cipher. And so, just following a standard operating procedure of cryptanalysis, which is a science, and by not allowing my own cognitive biases get in the way, or appeal to my own confirmation bias of trying to see what I want, only what I want to see, and not what's actually there, which is what a lot of these others did. Now, the problem, again, circling back to the Freedmans again, in Baconian cipher, or in Baconian circles, particularly the Sir Francis Bacon Society, the Freedmans are anathema because they did this, right? They debunked all of these people. The problem is they also included within their book a couple of ciphers that were actually legitimately done, and they debunked those as well. And then within their book, they also put in their own biliteral cipher for Baconians as a little Easter egg. And when I decrypted it, it said, I didn't write the plays, F. Bacon. Okay, so they did that to kind of troll the Baconians who were upset with them for debunking really bad work. But in the process, they also, because there was so much of it, it was really easy to do, right? These were just bad decryptions. And so what they did was they lumped in a good one with the bad one to also, basically debunk that one as well, even though it was actually kind of legit. So because of that, they did a bit of a disinformation campaign against, Sir Francis Bacon. And ever since then, this type of research is scoffed at, made fun of, and here I went and did it anyway. So I have a very niche interest, and then suddenly,
you do.
Few people, are really interested. And then when people actually do go through and look at what I've done, by the time they get to the end of it, they say, this is real, because like I said, I'm not the only one doing this now. That's the good thing, Joe. Other people, I threw a challenge out there on my podcast a few times. I said, look, if you don't believe me, if you think I'm full of it, I don't blame you, first of all, because this is all very hard to swallow.
Yeah.
But take a look for yourself, see what you can find. And other people have started to do it. I have them as guests sometimes on my own podcast now on the Ghost of Bacon. William Russell over in England is just a wizard at this. So is Jason Mercer, a good friend of mine who got involved in this. Said, you're not going to believe what I find. And he uses a draftsman's technique, which is, a legitimate form of decryption when it comes to steganography. Steganography just simply means when you're looking at an image or a text, you have the surface text, but encrypted within it is another message. That's all steganography means. And so he uses these techniques to also uncover, really interesting alignments and values using Bacon cipher systems.
And do you, but by I forgot the term you just used, draftsman, kind of architecture, right? Certain angles.
Yes, and the way he does it is really, it's so neat. He'll take an image that, he knows that I've discovered has, signposts of say, an encryption of the Rosy Cross. Say it's a cover of a book, for example. And what he does is he'll use the simple draftsman techniques of trying to identify the exact center of the image or the page. And so he just draws lines from the top corner down to the left, then the other corner down to the right, and then identifies the very center point. Then he draws a line straight up and down, then a line straight across, and looks for significant alignments between letters. Mm-hmm. And oftentimes when these lines cross specific letters, you can spell things out, like the name Bacon, for example. Mm-hmm. And oftentimes it will, center on a specific word on a page. And when you calculate the values in the cipher systems of that word, all of a sudden it's a significant value that's associated with, Francis Bacon, those kinds of things. Mm-hmm. He's been able to do, in a very convincing way. Then he uses angles of known Bacon signatures. For example, starting if there's a significant point on the page, you can draw a line at 33 degrees, 33 being the value of Bacon in simple cipher, very common signature. And so you can do that and see what alignments appear. And it's not by happenstance that these things happen. It's by design. Mm-hmm.
So they're happening over and over in
repeatability. Yeah. Repeatability. And, William Russell is doing the same, very similar things to what I do. Again, the messages repeat, and what we're all discovering is, and before I even published this book, I shared this information with them what I had discovered, that the man we know as Walter Raleigh was actually Walter Stewart the First, and Bacon was Francis Stewart the Third, if you will. Their names wouldn't have been Stewart, of course. They would have gone with the House of Valois Angoulême of their father, so their name would have been Angoulême. So
who was Francis II?
Francis II, correct. So the thing is, though, they use these combinations of names as signposts. One of the ones that they use the most is Stuart King, the values of the words Stuart King. And it's really interesting. So as soon as I shared those values with the rest of the guys, I said, listen, here's what's going on here, are the messages I'm seeing. What are you seeing? And they all unanimously said, we've been seeing these numbers too. We just didn't know what they meant. And now as we start to really delve into the meanings of these values and these numbers that keep coming up in these encryptions, what we've done is we've recreated, I believe, what I call Bacon's code book. It's a series of numbers that when you see them in their proper context with these other known numbers, this is the message they're sending. And the message is always the same. These men were the sons of Mary, Queen of Scots, and Francis II. This was a truth that was encoded into everything they touched.
Okay. And to kind of go down the rabbit hole that is the cipher systems, how many cipher systems did Bacon use?
Well, from what I've seen, he used at least 6. The first, of course, being his biliteral cipher, which he invented when he was 16 years old.
And is that in the Advancement of Learning?
Yes. Yeah,
Okay.
he talks about that in Advancement of Learning. Yes, exactly. And the others, that he doesn't really talk about, but we see that he has used, because they were in use during his time period, was simple cipher, reverse cipher. These are very simple. You just simply assign a letter of the alphabet starting at 1 and A and ending up at Z and 24. That's simple. Reverse, you just reverse it. So A is 24, Z is 1, right? Very simple process. The more complicated one called K cipher is just the way it's constructed is just genius. And then the other two is something called fourfold cipher. Fourfold is really pretty interesting. I see that being used mostly in connection with his aliases, because I uncovered what I call the RC alias formula. And you can actually use this formula to identify whether or not this person in history was instead actually an alias. It's one of the data points that I use to corroborate these indications. And then the last is something called Elizabethan short cipher. This only uses the numbers 1 through 9, and the alphabet just kind of folds back upon itself. And that's how you assign values to each of the letters.
And again, it's the Elizabethan alphabet, right? Not our current alphabet.
Correct. Our current alphabet has 26 letters. Elizabethan alphabet did not have the letters J or U. They used the letters I and V, respectively, in their place. And so when we do these calculations, you have to remember that we were only using those 24 values. Mm-hmm. And so to that end, one of the things that I've discovered is that all of these cipher systems interrelate in certain messages. For example, in my book, I cite the example of the famous portrait of Walter Raleigh. And, it uses, there's an image of a quarter moon in the upper left-hand corner, and then his motto. And so when you calculate the values of the motto, the values of that motto in simple, reverse K, fourfold, and short cipher are all exactly the same as Walter Stewart the First. And so that there's no way that that's an accident. There's no way it's coincidence.
Yeah. So
it's just simply not possible.
Is that the reason Bacon and Walter, so Francis and Walter, used so many systems? It was kind of a verification process.
Absolutely. And I mean, if you get just simple reverse and K cipher all to match exactly a phrase with a form of their secret name, their secret identity, that in and of itself is just very convincing and compelling evidence. However, one of the things that I spend a great deal, I repeat this message in my book, I think at least 3 times, because while I was writing, I said, I have to include this idea again. People often use a fallacy in logic called hypothesis contrary to fact. And I bring this up simply because I was talking with an Oak Island researcher who will remain nameless, a theorist and researcher. And this person said, well, Jake, I'm sure a lot of names would do the same thing. I said, show me one. Mm-hmm. And this person looked at me and said, go ahead. If it's that easy, just show me one name that works with one of the ciphers. And they paused for a moment. I said, because what you're saying is hypothesis counter effect. You're making up a fake situation that a lot of names would fit this and do this. And it's not true. It's not provable. So you can't use that as an argument, right? I said, come up with just one name that doesn't even fit the context of this historical period that matches all 5 systems. It can't be done.
Mm-hmm.
And they had to exceed. They said, well, okay, you have a point. I said, no. I said, this is very similar to what people call the infinite monkey hypothesis, where if you have enough monkeys hammering out on a keyboard, eventually one of them is going to produce one of the works of Shakespeare.
Mm-hmm.
No, it's not testable. It's not provable. It's a fake situation that doesn't and can't possibly exist.
Yeah.
So, that's always my response. I spent, like I said, I had to repeat that a few times in the book, saying, listen, the fact that this one portrait has this motto on it, and no one's ever really been able to understand why. All of a sudden they said, oh, well, this is the family motto of the Raleigh clan. And yeah, well, the evidence they use is just that portrait, right? The evidence they use for his age was that same portrait. It's very circular thinking of, well, this is true because it's here, and since it's here, it's true. Once you start delving beneath the surface and you discover that that motto has the same value as Walter Stewart I in all 5 cipher systems, it's within the context of Walter Raleigh. There's his painting, right?
Is it Amor and Virtute or something like that?
Amor et Virtute, yeah. Okay. And so, and when we look at that and you calculate those, can't possibly be a coincidence.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. And can you talk a little bit about sigils and what sigils are?
Oh, sure. A lot of the people of the time had. Are you talking about their animal sigils?
The animal sigil, yeah.
Yeah. Specifically, we have the sigil for the Stuart, the royal Stuart family, of course, is the lion. Okay, and on the side going like this, right? You have for Raleigh, we had the stag or the deer, right? And lastly, of course, Bacon had the boar, the Bacon family. And in each of their coat of arms, you will see these animals, prominently displayed. And they actually used these on Walter Raleigh's maps of Guyana and the Amazon, right? And they actually told a story. You had, in one image, you have the stag of Raleigh battling with its horns an armadillo. Of course, that was symbolic of the Spanish Armada, right? A little play on words there. And then behind him, you have, in front of him, you have a lion turned away. And beneath the stag, you have an image of the goddess Artemis taking aim at the lion. And off to the side, you have, right next to them, you have the boar looking like it's yelling at the stag to not shoot the lion. And so Artemis, we all know that Sir Francis Bacon was closely identified by the god Apollo. Okay, Apollo had a twin. His twin was Artemis. And what I've discovered is on all of the Raleigh information, you will see images associated with Artemis, the archer. And so that's what that represented, was the fact that James was turning his back on the war with Spain and sued them for peace. Raleigh wanted to keep it going because he wanted to just keep fighting the Spanish. And Bacon, of course, was yelling at Walter saying, leave James alone. Mm-hmm. And so we know that Raleigh spent a great deal of time, was arrested by James for the main plot. The main plot, historically speaking, is allegedly the idea that Walter Raleigh and some others conspired against James to replace him with Arabella Stuart, their cousin. And in fact, I think it probably had more to do with Raleigh may have been conspiring early on. So he was like, hey, kid brother, get out of my chair, And I think originally there was a deal between Francis Bacon, Walter Raleigh, and Queen Elizabeth I, that Raleigh would be her successor. He would come out as Walter Stewart the first, and because they had their birth records, they had their royal birth records, they knew who they were, but these two twin princes were Queen Elizabeth's greatest supporters, and so I think that Robert Devereux, the second Earl of Essex, caught wind of this deal, and I think that's why history states that he was upset over the undue influence of a couple of courtiers, and one of them was Sir Walter Raleigh. And so I think if he were to discover that, you know what, she's going to be giving the throne to Walter and not Robert, I think that because one of the courtiers at the time when Essex stormed her court to try to capture her, he was trying to talk. According to him, he was trying to just get a chance to talk to her and plead his case. I think one of the courtiers said, "You seek to take her down and raise yourself up as Robert the First." Okay, accused him of trying to usurp the throne. So why would they say that to him if he wasn't actually her son, right? He was her eldest son, and so I think that he kind of caught wind of this plot. And again, this is all speculation on my point, at my part. However, the ciphertext that I've read, Bacon states that he greatly regretted the whole thing with Essex. He said it was his greatest folly.
Prosecuting Essex.
Prosecuting Essex. He said that was his greatest folly. And he tried to push back a little bit, but he said the Queen was so angry and upset that it would have cost him his head too. He said that his neck would have been next for the axe if he hadn't prosecuted him, and he didn't want to do it. So it was a really when you look at the events as they happen in history, along with how it was recorded and by whom, and then all of a sudden we read these contrarian messages that aren't actually all that contrarian at all. They actually fit in with recorded history. It's really pretty enlightening, and it's why at the beginning of this interview I started out saying that a lot of this information is, I use the word disbelievable, right? Not that it's unbelievable, because it is, but I use the word disbelievable because it's meant with disbelief, because it's so runs beyond the pale of what we think we know. Mm-hmm. And again, when we start to reason it out and think about it logically, it all makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, yeah. It's astounding, right? Yeah. At the end of the day, it's astounding. Yeah. And we may have talked about this in our where did Bacon get the cipher idea from? Was it from France? Was it his?
I believe so. I know that he was exposed to a lot of the cipher work when he was in France. And of course, being a part of Ambassador Amias Paulet, his entourage, of course, it would have, of course, he was, answering to, I think it was Francis Walsingham back in London, the whole leader of the spy ring. He would have been exposed to this starting at a very early age, and especially, his father, his surrogate father, Sir Nicholas Bacon, being the keeper of the seal. He would have been steeped in this, from childhood, and obviously since he was such a polymath and a genius, he would have just absorbed it. And I think that particularly a couple of the specific ciphers, he came up with, as I said, biliteral cipher when he was 16. That was about the time he was in France. And I think that, being involved with the French court, looking at all the work that, the king had surrounded himself with intellectual elites and writers and painters and artists, and seeing what they were doing in trying to consolidate the French language, particularly through the work of they referred to themselves as the Pleiades, the poets and playwrights. Bacon was greatly enamored in all of that work. And the thing is that what I've discovered is that a lot of the plays that were being put on at that time actually, contained intelligence messages. And so, you look at Kit Marlowe, Christopher Marlowe, was a famous playwright in his own time. And he was also a known intelligencer for Queen Elizabeth I. And when I started looking at this, I said, well, this guy is a perfect candidate as an alias or a mask. And sure enough, it turns out he was Walter Raleigh, the man who became Walter Raleigh. And so, this is what they were doing. And so I think that, he probably saw what they were doing in France and recognized that they were also incorporating some of these messages to each other and doing it through, public performances. And as well as, their paintings and so on, just like I have now uncovered with Bacon and Raleigh. So, yeah, I think there was a big exposure there. I wouldn't be surprised if it was also, an influence from the Medicis, his grandmother, Catherine Medici.
The powerful family from Italy.
Yeah, very scary lady. So, being around that type of environment, it just would have been, a perfect way for him to just, really dive in and blossom with some of this stuff. And I think that, some of the ciphers, such as Elizabethan short cipher, I think that was something that he adopted from someone else. I think that K cipher was something that he specifically created. Now, no one's ever been able to prove that, but based upon, they're actually his own methodologies are encrypted within that cipher itself, and some of his signatures. And so I see that as being, his own creation for sure.
And to take a step back to sigils, the rabbit or the hare, is that an important sigil in the Baconian world?
It is, depending upon context, and like I said, I always preach this to everyone, because a lot of times people will see a number, right? And they'll say, oh, 33 bacon. And it doesn't mean anything unless there's context for it. Just like, that value of Raleigh's motto, right? It's there on his painting, therefore it has context. And so when it comes to sigils, for example, the rabbit, when you look at it in context, first of all, when you calculate the values of the word rabbit or even coney, you can get some pretty interesting correlations to Bacon. However, when you have, I saw this the first time many years ago on Peter Dawkins's website, the Francis Bacon Research Trust, and he illustrates how there is a rabbit looking over its back, and it's being chased by a dog. It's in one of the headpieces. I also decrypt it in my latest book in a slightly different way, but it does bear mentioning, and I do mention and give a shout out to Mr. Dawkins about this, because he says that the hare looking back over its back, in England, a rabbit is called a coney, and so you look at the back, it's bacony,
and also, what's the Latin word you used for brother?
Oh, frater.
No, you said something like, you used a word similar to coney.
Oh gosh.
You said it in the beginning of the interview, and it reminded me of the rabbit coney, the use of coney.
Right. Yeah.
So there's a similarity there.
There is a similarity there. Yeah. And so what he was saying was that it's a pictorial cipher of a coney looking over its back, and then combined as bacony, which is his name, Bacon. But yeah, it happens also in the painting that I finished the book with. Just saying, names like this of incredibly famous Renaissance artists, and saying, well, this was actually an alias, or maybe even a mask. Maybe these people were real, and then they stepped in and just used their name a few times and painted some paintings, and that were included in the bunch. But the famous painting of Diana returning from the hunt by Peter Paul Rubens names Bacon as the painter there. So Peter Paul Rubens, of course, I make some really interesting connections with him in my last book, because he was responsible for painting the ceiling of the banquet house that was commissioned by Charles I, who would have been Bacon's nephew, the son of James I. And unfortunately, that's of course where Charles also, was executed, was on the steps of the banquet house. So I think that Raleigh and Bacon designed and painted that whole structure. Um, and and of course, it's really interesting is that the painting on the roof of the banquet, or the ceiling of the banquet house, is the apotheosis of James. Apotheosis, of course, means to become godlike, right? And so it was a real huge, nod to the divine right of kings. And this is what really, well, in the end, was Charles the First's undoing.
Okay. And doing my research too, so a name that is associated with rabbit or coney or hare is Watt.
Yeah.
W-T. So
W-T. Originally that was Walter's nickname, right? So everyone called him Watt. And then once he was, married, and then Queen Elizabeth actually called him Water, which, for, a sea captain and, one of her, greatest allies, if she is the queen that is associated with Cynthia or Diana, the moon goddess, right? So, that she would be in charge of the tides, and she calls him Water. That kind of indicates a symbolic relationship between these two. He was very devoted to her, even though he also believed he was next in line for the throne, because Bacon didn't want it, according to his words. So, yeah, you have this Watt connection, and the whole idea of these sigils too is the neat thing is they appear in the strangest places, and I, like I said, I point out a few of those in my book, The Keys of the Rosy Cross.
Yeah, and Venus and Adonis is probably rife, right, with
sigils. Oh yeah,
yeah,
absolutely. So when you actually go through and you start looking at these paintings, you can actually pick apart pictorial ciphers, and one thing that people have to understand is when you're looking at a pictorial cipher, what Bacon and Raleigh and Drake was also a really great artist. A lot of people didn't realize. If you look at what they did, they were operating, and the Rosy Cross operated under the principle of the Pythagorean system, right? Pythagoras. He believed that everything could be explained through number. By converting everything to numbers, you can understand things. Well, that's just a code for saying, here's how you decrypt these ciphers. You look at this picture, and you look at the image in it, and you calculate the value of the name of this thing. So in what is it? Diana returning from the hunt, you have, I think, 2 rabbits over the back of one of her handmaids, right? So we have another big coney, or a coney over someone's back, but there are 2 of them. And when you calculate rabbit and multiply it by 2, you end up with 100 for Francis Bacon, and then in reverse cipher, it's 200 for Francis Bacon in reverse. All of the numbers play out to his name. Same thing, there are 4 dogs chasing them. And when you calculate, dog, multiply times 4, you get the same exact numbers. So, none of this can be coincidence.
Yeah. And did you finish your story about Peter Dawkins? He said about an image of a hare.
Yeah. He was the first that I ever found that pointed that out, of a coney looking over its back, represented the idea of the name Baconi, or back coney, So I just thought that was really, really clever and interesting. And then as I started to apply the cipher systems to this concept, it just added more information and more data points.
Okay. And I want, in reading Hamlet too, water is a huge element in Hamlet. So I was wondering, so is that probably a reference to Walter then?
Yeah, there are references to both of them in Hamlet, actually. And I like that you're bringing up water. In particular, they talk about, in Hamlet's famous soliloquy, to be or not to be, that is question whether it is noble in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or take arms against a sea of troubles, and by opposing end them. And so you have this idea of the overwhelming force of water, right? When you look at the title of Hamlet, in particular, Prince of Denmark with its spelling with an E, they all of a sudden the value of Denmark becomes the same as France's. And
Mhm.
so in these little Easter eggs hidden throughout there, these are little signposts. Now, so many people have often used, the cipher systems to pick out the signposts, right? And say, here it is, that's proof, and it's not proof. I think that when you have these correlations of all 5 cipher systems, for example, with the Raleigh portrait, in my mind, that's definitive. That's irrefutable. But when we just find, these, when you see a page number is wrong in the first folio, okay, that's a clue. Yes, it's an indication there's something there on that page probably. But then how you go about finding it and how you go about decrypting it is a whole nother matter. And so people often point to the signposts as being the evidence and the proof, and that's as far as it goes. When in reality, these are just little signposts that are just waving a little red flag to you, saying, "Hey, here I am. Come find the message."
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that's how that works.
Okay. And in Venus and Adonis, I know they refer to the boar, the stag, and the lion. Mm-hmm. They also refer to the bear. Is the bear a sigil for one of those 3 gentlemen, or is it astronomical? Does it refer to a constellation?
I don't know. I wondered that myself, because my first inclination would have been that it was Ursa Major, right? Because when you look at that part of the sky, first of all, they use it for navigational purposes in the northern hemisphere, and they were all navigators. But also in that same area of the sky are a whole series of constellations that represent Francis Bacon in a variety of ways. You have Hercules. He was called the Hercules of philosophy. On the opposite side, you have then next to that you have Corona Borealis, the crown, right? You have Ophiuchus, which is the healer, and so within that whole region of the sky, you have a whole host of constellations representing him, and so I don't know if it's a reference to that, but I haven't found any other references to the bear other than Venus and Adonis.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And you've mentioned this, the materials. What materials? Materials he used for ciphers, Francis and Walter, and we've talked about this before, but it could be books, maps, paintings, pictures, right?
Yeah. In this work, it's been, and you keep mentioning rabbit holes, but that's again, here we go down the Coney hole, right?
Yeah.
But that's what it's been like, people, when they understand what I've done and we talk about it, or they read my books, they say, this reminds me of the National Treasure movies. And, one clue leads to the next. And that's, that's the best way I found to actually explain it to people, is that the plaque on Shakespeare's funerary monument was the Rosetta Stone for all of this. And what it's done is yes, it's led me to maps. Then it leads me to portraits, and then it leads me to another, artist name. Then it leads me to Walter Raleigh, and you need to look at him. So I start looking at his books. The frontispiece of his History of the World in 5 parts has a cornucopia of different messages, repeating the same message of being the Dauphin of France and a twin. It's all in there. So one thing leads to another, and it's all containing the same. They're all containing the same message. Okay. They're secret identities.
Okay. And Francis, of course, his major numerical signature is 33, correct?
Yeah, that's the value of the name Bacon in simple cipher, the most commonly known ones. Yeah.
And so you kind of have a twin, a 3 and a 3, but then you have the number 3. So the third brother being, and we've talked about him, is King James. Does he have a more prominent role than we realize, as far as the arts are concerned, as far as the writings are concerned, the pictures, the paintings are concerned?
I think so. I suspect that he knew exactly what these two were up to, and so much so that at a certain point, when Raleigh was locked in the Tower of London because of the main plot and so on, at a certain point, James secretly let him out so that he could go out and operate under an alias. That alias was Peter Easton, the famous privateer and pirate. when James sued Spain for peace, most of the privateers, forgive the pun, jumped ship and started working for Denmark as privateers, and started operating out of there. Both Bacon and Raleigh did this, but the interesting thing is that Bacon even says that James let Walter out of his cage, in his terms,
and that's a cipher message that you gleaned, right?
Yes. It's very easy to read. He says James let Walter out of his cage. He says, "Go be pirate king in America." Mm-hmm. It's just the way he said it. It's just really great. And so you have this idea that James's role in this, yes, much larger, but it also gives him plausible deniability, right? He's not actually directly connected to Peter Easton, so if he's out there, attacking the Spanish, he's like, well, he's a pirate, and we can try to take him down, but he has a fleet bigger than any country. At his height, Peter Easton Raleigh had a fleet of 40 ships, and he was a country unto himself. And there were a couple of times where he was negotiated a plea from the king of being exonerated, and he says, "What do I need that for? I'm king of the seven seas. I don't need that. Mm-hmm. I'm a king unto myself."
Referring to Raleigh.
Raleigh, yeah, as Easton. He was given a couple of times. He was given pardons for his piracy, and he said, "I don't need it." Mm-hmm. There wasn't a country that could take him down. Mm-hmm. So it was really pretty impressive. And really, that was the whole premise, I think, behind both Raleigh and Bacon were extremely prominent in urging the colonization scheme, right, of the plantations in Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, and the New World. And so, for all intents and purposes, this is where they planned on setting up their own kingdoms. Their own thrones in France and England and Scotland were already occupied. So they said, well, let's make our own. And that was their plan.
Well, and you reference it in your book, in the name of Quebec during that time was New France, correct?
Yes.
Okay, so you had New France in Canada and you had New England in America.
Right.
Okay.
Right. And the Maritimes were a part of it. There was kind of like a dividing line between the two. And Raleigh's base of operations was Newfoundland. Again, the funerary plaque led me to the treasure map drawn by Samuel de Champlain, his famous 1612 navigational chart. It has, encrypted directions in it that lead directly to Oak Island, Nova Scotia. That's not a mistake. And within that map, there are also other ciphers that talk about how, other locations, how they used Oak Island as their base of operations, and some of the things that they found there. So it's really pretty interesting once you, start digging into it. And, this is something that I've shared with my friends on Oak Island, Judy Rudebush and Rick and others, that, I never claimed that Bacon and Raleigh were the ones who were responsible for all the works on Oak Island. But I did uncover a message where they actually reference the Knights Templar. They happened upon the Templars' Petra or stone boulder cross. So that's a reference to those of you who are fans of Oak Island. That's a reference to what they call Nolan's Cross. And Bacon and Raleigh identified it as being left there, probably by Templars. So,
and that's a series of stones that forms a cross on the island, right?
Yeah. It's a big megalithic. The alignments are just again not random, not random, definitely man-made. They were shaped by human hands into conical shapes, and so and this was one of the latest discoveries I made. That it still remains unpublished, and there are parts of it that are proprietary that I'm going to obviously keep to myself. But yeah, it was the first time, because people had, since I started doing this, especially my friends, my Okinawan friends, and the other researchers and theorists, they say, have you found any references to the Knights Templar? Did the Rosicrucians come from the Knights Templar? And I always said no. I see none of that. And in fact, now that I finally did find that the word Templar repeated a few times in one of these transposition ciphers, it comes across as being something that's as simple as they say, we happened upon this, right? It's not something that they inherited as a legacy. It's just they happened to run into Templar works. And where did they do it? Oak Island.
Okay.
And that's the only connection I've ever been able to find between these two groups.
Okay. Okay. And to kind of go back in history a little bit. So how did Francis, we'll talk with Francis, how did Francis Drake and Francis Bacon connect? Is there any understanding on how they connected?
Yeah. I believe that before Drake began his circumnavigation, if I remember correctly, he was the one that carried the Paulette ambassador entourage to France, if I remember correctly. And Drake by then was already famous throughout England, right? And so, of course, they would have crossed paths. Here you have Francis being referred to by Queen Elizabeth I as her little Lord Keeper, because he was so intelligent, so precocious. And of course, Drake was there, as one of her, her admirals or captains. So what I found happened was, while Francis was in France between the ages of 16 and 18, that's when Drake sailed around the world. And I believe that's when, I think he took Walter with him.
Wait, and this is the latter 1570s?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And so, it would have been, 77 probably.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. And so here you had Francis going to France, and I think that Walter went to sea with Drake. Again, that's partial speculation, but I know for a fact that they both did sail with him. And so I think that when Sir Nicholas died, when Francis was 18, he was still in France, he returned to England, only to discover that Sir Nicholas hadn't really finalized his will to leave anything for Francis, right? And so instead it went to most of the older siblings, and of course his wife, Lady Anne. And so I think at that time, this is the perfect opportunity for this 18-year-old young man who has already traveled throughout Europe in the style of a prince, basically, who had come of age. That suddenly here, comes Francis Drake into port, being the greatest navigator in English history, who circumnavigated the world. He's world famous. He's like, yep, I'm going to go out and start continue harassing the Spanish, and you want to come along. And so the message in my first book that states that is that he said he had the time of his life as first mate to King of the Seven Seas, F. Drake. He says, F. Drake chose me as his wisest astrologus, or astronomer. I time meridians. So that's what he was doing. He became his navigator, his first mate. It would be the perfect. He had, what else was he going to do? History shows him setting up shop as a scrivener's shop with Anthony, right? When they return, and I believe that they did do that, but I don't think they had to be there on site, present for them to. Exactly, because they were doing plenty of writing and painting at sea. And that's one of Bacon's first messages I decrypted. He says, "I wrote books at sea."
Mm-hmm. And painted, right? You referenced that they painted.
Yeah, in fact, what's really neat is during the Spanish Inquisition, there were some men that Drake had captured and had on board his ship, and then later released. One of them was a Portuguese sailor, the other was a Spanish sailor. but they got caught up in the Inquisition because since they were captives on Drake's ship, he made them go to church with the English church, and they didn't take communion, and so the Inquisitors brought them in to question them about that, and as for heresy, because they weren't following the Catholic teachings. They were doing the English church. So what they did was they, in their testimony, they recorded this, that both basically said the same thing, that that Francis Drake was an amazing artist, and he employed artists on board his ship as well in his cabin. Both times that they were in the cabin, they had these other men and Drake were painting landscapes that were so perfect and lifelike of the locations of where the Spanish were, that anyone looking at those paintings and then going to the place could never mistake it, right? It was a form of intelligence that the gathering is what they were doing. They were painting the landscapes of all of these locations, right? So others, captains could go and find the same locations. And so this, strategically speaking, this is really, really important, in this war between Spain and England. And so much so that the prisoners said that this really concerned them, because these artists were so good. And one of them they referred to as Drake's nephew or younger cousin named John. And that was a Francis Bacon alias.
Okay.
So,
and since we're kind of on the art track, is it Nicholas Hilliard? So through your cipher work, you believe Nicholas Hilliard is a mask for who?
Oh, I got it wrong in the first book. Everything I was still learning how to do all of this while I was writing my first book, but it was so compelling that I felt like I needed to get this out. And all of the cipher values indicated that Nicholas Hilliard was Francis Bacon. And when you look at their, Hilliard's self-portrait next to the portrait he did of Francis, they look stunningly similar. They could be twins. In fact, they were, because as it turns out, Hilliard was actually Raleigh. And so, I corrected that mistake in this next book, because at the time of the first book's writing, I hadn't, developed and uncovered the alias formula yet to figure out exactly how that worked. I knew it was a thing, but I was still, researching and trying to find out more information on how to get it to work. And that was one of the biggest developments, I think, in my second book is, that adds such a really great data point that, it works on every single alias. And if it's not an alias, it doesn't work, right? So that's been kind of neat. So yeah, Hilliard is really, really interesting, because when you start going down the Hilliard rabbit hole, you discover that Hilliard painted portraits of every single person who would have been in the know of their secret identities as the sons of Mary, Queen of Scots, and Francis II. So all of the people involved in the story had a miniature painted of them by Nicholas Hilliard.
Can you name a few of those folks that he did paint?
Oh, sure. Aeneas Paulette, for example.
Okay.
There was another, I forget his name, but he was involved in the negotiations of allowing Mary to come back to Scotland when they were negotiating with Elizabeth I. He painted multiple miniatures of Elizabeth I. He painted them of Sir Francis Drake. He also created what was called the Drake Jewel. He painted that and created that for Sir Francis Drake. And, again, it's like so many others as well. I think Marguerite of Navarre. Yeah.
Okay. And Marguerite of Navarre, was she in France? Was that?
Yes, she was. Ended up being the wife of, I believe, Henry IV.
Okay.
Henri, yeah, King of France.
And was that the woman that Francis fell in love with? I can't read. That's not her, is it?
Some people, hypothesize that Francis Bacon was in love with her, very much so.
Okay.
I believe she's the one. Yeah.
Okay. So let's see here. And did they have a complicated relationship with Drake? Did they eventually separate from Drake prior to Drake's death?
I don't think so. I think that they were all operating together, and I think when I think that Drake also experienced what was called the philosophical death. You know, the whole story of the way he dies, and they seal him inside of a lead coffin and drop him off the coast of California somewhere without knowing really where. Um, I want to know, what are you doing carrying around a lead coffin on a ship?
Mm-hmm.
You know, when you have limited cargo space, and you know, you weight is very, very important, whether you have ballast where so that you don't ride too high, or you know, all of a sudden you're weighting yourself down and not being able to sail as fast. I mean, the idea that they were just keeping a lead coffin around, well, we might need it.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't make any sense to me.
Mm-hmm.
It makes no logical sense. And what does make sense is that I know, you know, how they had faked so many of these deaths. Um, that Drake, with his privateering, yes, you know, he had to return all of the riches to Queen Elizabeth. But I'm sorry, but what sea captain isn't going to say, okay, so I'm going to stop here and I'm going to put a little something away for myself here. So I'm going to have to retire sometime soon. I can't do this forever.
Yeah, yeah.
And so,
well, I think he retired one of the wealthiest men in England, didn't he?
oh yeah, yeah, and I'm sure that, you know, when he died, he just ended up vacationing somewhere warm.
Yeah.
You know.
Can you go into a little bit what you mean by philosophic death?
Oh yeah, I'm sorry. This is a term that you know, occultists use, and by occultists I mean and people who look at things that are hidden, right? Um, what it is it's when the member of the Rosy Cross in this case, um, they look around, they say, well, I think I've done everything I can with this mortal coil. I'm going to shuffle this one off.
This particular
I,
mass.
I'm, yep, I'm going to. Well, you know, the way they phrase it in All the World's a Stage, and the men are merely players. Each with their entrances or their exits and their entrances. The way they phrase that is the exit is first, right, and then their entrances. That's backwards. You know, if you're going to anyone who's been on stage, anyone who's done any acting, you know that you make an entrance and then you make your exit.
Mm-hmm.
But in that line, they say they each has their exits and their entrances. So in that sense, there's also a very famous phrase that came from, I believe, Ben Jonson, that talks about a wise man has is a chest that has a false bottom in it. You know, it's this idea of you have to have an escape hatch, and I think that what they would do is they would fake their death, as you know, in this case, at the age of 65, Francis Bacon died on Easter, I believe it was, and then he stepped forward and became someone else. You know, he just assumed another name. And interesting thing was, you know, he supposedly died at the Lord of Arundel, and that happens to be an alias for Walter Raleigh.
At his home. You're saying at
his home. Yeah, at his estate. And his friend wasn't home, but you know, he made himself at home because he was sick, right? So he had a little of assistance there from his twin brother when he shuffled off the name of Francis Bacon.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. And in our previous interview, you did mention some of the people you thought he became.
Yes. Yeah. And I think one of his later ones that, you know, he really stuck with a lot was Peter Paul Rubens.
The artist.
The artist, famous Renaissance artist, yes.
Yep. Okay. Yep. And so we'll take kind of another step back. So Samuel de Champlain.
Mm-hmm.
What years was he that mask?
Oh gosh. The thing is that I think that there were many of these masks simultaneously, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Because, you know, the years that, you know, obviously Quebec was being founded, you know, and Champlain was going back and forth. Obviously, he was operating as Samuel de Champlain when he published Champlain's book. I think that was 1613. And so basically the early 1600s, he was Champlain for a good, 8 years or so, but or even longer. But at the same time, he was also writing books under different names. He was also publishing and painting under different names, and so that's what it's hard to explain to a modern audience of thinking, how could this one guy be so many people and live so many different lives? The fact is, he did many of them simultaneously, and we often forget that these guys didn't punch a time clock the way the rest of us do. They didn't have to literally work for a living. These were noblemen, and if they had to sit in Parliament, that was not a 9 to 5 job 7 days a week, right? They would show up, it would be in session, and then they wouldn't have to go back for a while. So all of these different things that he did, many of them were, like I said, simultaneous. What I found is that the years of 1611, 1612 through 1616, this was a watershed moment for a lot of this material. A large bulk of this materials appear in those years for whatever reason. You have the King James Bible of 1611, right? We have the Champlain map of 1612. We have the funerary monument of 1616. And so to be able to say that, he was, Champlain from this period from this year to this year, and that's all he did, it wouldn't work, right? So that's the best answer I can give you for that question, Joe.
Okay.
It's like, but I know for a fact that all of the years that we see Champlain in history, he was being Champlain, but the chances are he was also being other people at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and obviously with Raleigh, right? So the Shakespeare works as well, and you have the publication of the sonnets in 1609 and
1609.
Okay, and so we'll kind of get into that track here a little bit.
Sure.
So in the sonnets, we have 3 identities that have been problematic for folks.
Mm-hmm.
So is it the fair youth? Who was the
fair youth? The fair youth, the dark lady, and the rival poet.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is, based upon what I've discovered, is I think that these sonnets were actually written when both Walter and Francis were very young, maybe even their teenage years.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I know this sounds incredible, but and the reason is that I've identified the fair youth as Walter Raleigh, a young Walter Raleigh. And because of this, there's so much cipher evidence in the sonnets, and I gave us the tip of the iceberg. I think in my book, I have an entire chapter dedicated to it, and yet it's just the tip of the iceberg of what I found in them. I identified the fair youth as Walter Raleigh, or Walter Stewart in reality, and so the Dark Lady is none other than Mary Queen of Scots. Now. Their mother, and Walter is also the rival poet as well. And so I can show you mathematically. I demonstrate this in my book with the way the sonnets are structured, by the number of them and the number in each series. These are all cipher values, and so the first thing I had to dismiss, and when you say it out loud, you realize how ridiculous it is. Scholars have always said that Shakespeare, the real man, the Shakespeare, the actor who wrote the works of Shakespeare and wrote these sonnets, that he was actually in love with a deformed and dark, ugly woman. He was having an affair with her. Then even though she was repulsive, he couldn't resist her. And at the same time, he was having homoerotic feelings for this fair youth, who also was attracted to this dark lady who was repulsive. And there was this sick love triangle. When you think about that, that's absolutely ridiculous. And when you actually go in and you actually read these poems, knowing that you have the poet writing to this fair youth that he has this fraternal love for, deep and abiding love for his twin brother. and that he is warning him not to trust the Dark Lady because she's not to be trusted. Francis Bacon never trusted Mary Queen of Scots, and I think Walter wanted to. And I think that they had a very complicated relationship with her, and you have Francis warning Walter, listen, you have to be careful. You cannot trust this person. She, yes, we love her because she's our mother. So it wasn't a romantic love for the Dark Lady. It wasn't sexual. When you actually read the language, overtly there are some of the sonnets are sexual in nature, particularly 153 and 154. But when you realize that they were added later by Walter Raleigh, and he was actually writing about his wife Bess Throckmorton, suddenly everything becomes very, very clear. And so I think originally he had written 152 sonnets because that's a significant number for both brothers. But at the end of the day, we have the first section, the Fair Youth sequence. And then when we add on the rival poet, the Fair Youth sequence stops at 70, I think it's sonnet 77, which is the value of Rex Bacon. And 78, suddenly it starts a different sequence. And then when you remove the remainder, you end up with the value of 67, which is Francis in simple cipher. And so we look at the story and you read the ciphers, and if you know the context, suddenly you recognize that what you have here is Bacon talking about how complicated it is because he was raised in the house of Nicholas and Anne Bacon, who were ardently against Mary Queen of Scots and hated her. Mm-hmm. And so these boys were raised in this house to despise their birth mother, their biological mother. And at the same time, knowing that she's their biological mother, and I'm sure that they visited, you have Francis warning Walter, you can't trust her. Look what she gave us up at birth just to be able to come back to the Scottish throne, and she couldn't even keep that. So, yeah, and when you have, then you have, of course, Walter as being also the rival poet. And the reason is the name Wat appears in multiple acrostics within the poems themselves. And so when you see the Wat acrostic and you read the poem, and then you identify certain words that, have a significance within the context, and you can calculate their values, as I do in the book, suddenly you get the full story of what was really going on there. So, yes, I've identified the Fair Youth and rival poet both as Walter Raleigh, and the Dark Lady as Mary Queen of Scots.
Okay, very interesting. Very interesting. Okay, so to get into Anthony Bacon, so yeah. Was Walter born Anthony Bacon? I guess. So, okay, so who was Walter born as?
He was born as Walter Angoulême, and Francis was Francis Angoulême. But here's what they had to do. Here's the problem they had. Everyone in the French court would have known about them, right? And so what you have, and there were a couple of other times where Mary Queen of Scots announced to the French court that she was pregnant, and then she miscarried. And so, and then later on in life, she also had, she gave birth to twins a second time, but they were still born girls. And so this shows that she had a proclivity to produce twins. And so when we recognize that they came to England, and there was no way that Queen Elizabeth was going to allow her biggest rival to arrive back on the island with two, not one heir, but two. Okay, that's not gonna fly. So she had to give them up. That was the deal. And so what did they do? Well, as it turns out, Anthony Bacon, when he was born, he had two older sisters who died in early childhood, in their first or second year of being alive. They all had very weak constitutions, and basically, I don't remember what the malady was, but it was a cough and an infection and so on. And you had basically a 30% mortality rate in children back then. So This was something that was very common. So Lady Anne had two other daughters who died early in childhood. And then there's a letter that Sir Nicholas had written to one of his friends saying that his son Anthony, and his son Anthony would have been just a little over a year old at the time, I think, not quite two. He said, is currently recovering from a very serious illness, basically the same one that took his older sisters. He says, but he's currently recovering, is what he said. And then we don't hear any reference to Anthony Bacon again. So what I believe happened was Anthony Bacon, as a child, died in childhood early on. And now we have these two boys. And so Walter, they allowed him to assume Anthony's name. The ciphertext that I decrypted, Bacon states that Walter lived a free life as Anthony. So that indicated to me that logically, as I started to parse this out, that apparently the real Anthony Bacon had died as a child early on. And so they had Walter assume his identity. And instead of having Francis and Walter, the pair of them walking around under their birth names, he just assumed the identity of Anthony.
Okay.
That appears to be what happened.
Okay, and then Anthony Bacon, Walter Raleigh as Anthony Bacon, goes to the continent.
Yes. So Anthony Bacon, he gets dispatched as he's one of the Queen's intelligencers. He goes to Europe, and he stays there for a long time. And then, Lady Anne writes to him, says, you need to come home. The Queen is asking after you. You haven't shown yourself at court in a long time. And then a little while later, here we have Sir Walter Raleigh, all of a sudden larger than life, out of nowhere. He rises to the fore. He was one of the ones who denounced Edward de Vere and all of that sort of business. And so, he rises to prominence in Elizabeth's court. And then Anthony, a little while later, after 12 years of being away, appears, and Francis Bacon introduces Anthony to Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex, to become his secretary. So all it takes is Francis just to say, here's another one of their operatives, from Europe that they want in place to keep an eye on Essex. And meanwhile, Walter has already stepped forward and become Walter Raleigh. So here they have one of the other operatives assume the name of Anthony and work with Robert Devereux.
Okay, so a separate operative became the secretary, Devereux, and
I believe so.
And Anthony Bacon became Walter Raleigh.
Yeah.
Okay, and so
he came. Basically, he was Walter wearing the mask of Anthony, but then what he does is he steps forward, and they created the background of Walter Raleigh, and here he is. And so then we have this other guy coming in from the continent that Bacon introduces as his brother Anthony to Essex. Yeah.
Now,
and Walter Raleigh actually did that with another alias too, where he passed it off. He passed one off to, I think, his first mate as Peter Easton. And he said, here, you can be Peter Easton now. I got to go, back to England and do this. And that was the man who retired in Savoy as Peter Easton. And I think that he also passed off one of his painting aliases to his son Watt as well.
Okay. And a critic might say, well, how did people not notice a difference or a similarity between Anthony and Walter? Is there any information around that?
You know what? Not really, but it's actually pretty easily explained away when you consider that you had Anthony Bacon go away to Europe for 12 years. And now you have this guy who has established himself as Walter Raleigh in London. When Anthony Bacon comes back after 12 years, you would only have to look similar, right? And people wouldn't really probably even bat an eye and notice that this Anthony looks different than the Anthony that left. Well, of course he does. 12 years has passed.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then to piggyback on that, so how do you think they trick people with their looks? How did Francis trick people into believing he was Samuel? How did Walter trick people into believing, he was Anthony or, these other people? How did they trick people?
Oh, this is such a great question. I love it. Really, when you look at, say, just the portraitures, right? The portraits of these different people. If you look at the Lord Arundel, he looks strikingly similar to other aliases of Walter Raleigh. And all they would have to do in reality is, I mean, it's what spies do now. They change a little something about their features and put on a hat. That's what they do. They change just the way they look and appear. And back then, with all of the haircuts and the beard, all they would have to do is change a little bit of their hairstyle, maybe even the color, which was something that could be done then as well. That it would be a matter of doing that. There's, I think it was the Tycho Brahe that had a brass nose.
That sounds right.
Yeah. Well, you could say that you lost your nose in a duel and wear something like this that's going to distract people that's the only thing they're going to be able to look at. All right. These are a lot of, these are guys who spend a great deal of time changing their appearance on stage, when they're acting in the Globe Theater. And so the idea of doing a little something as a disguise is actually a pretty simple matter. You look at, like I said, how do spies operate today? They might have a backpack on, and then they duck into a bathroom, they change a shirt, put on a different color hat, and put on a pair of glasses, and then walk out and they're a different person.
Mm-hmm. And they might have not had sustained interactions with the same individuals, right? It could have been
bingo. And the other thing too, a lot of this was just simply done via writing,
mm-hmm.
right? And all they would have to do is sign a different name.
Okay. And in the Shakespeare works, of course, they reference, the way people move. So, of course, they probably moved a different way or affected a different way of movement.
Well, yeah, and this is actually encoded within the, well, it's not even encoded. It's written in the Rosicrucian manifestos and the Fama Fraternitatis. They talk about, the 6 items of what they do in order to be a member of the Rosy Cross. And one of them is when you're in a country, you assume the habit and customs of whatever country you're in, mm-hmm. right? Habit, of course, means clothes, mm-hmm. and customs, obviously, language and way of behaving. But that also includes this whole idea of, like you said, the way they would walk, perhaps the way they would speak. So there are any number of ways to do that.
When in Rome.
When in Rome, yeah.
Okay, so another famous mask for, well, I'll say the Orthodox historical person. Who is De Vere?
Well, people would tell you that he was Shakespeare. People would tell you that. Well, originally in my first book, I made a mistake in a decryption, and I didn't complete it because it was really about Robert Devereux. And within Devereux is also the name De Vere. And so I had thought that the first message I had decrypted stated that he was the son of Queen Elizabeth, but he wasn't. It was a mistake I made in the decryption. Once I completed it after the first publication, that's one of the things that obviously I'm going to go in and correct when I do a second edition, but because it was actually about Robert Devereux. But De Vere, as it turns out, was a mask, at least, for Walter Raleigh. And again, this is contentious because we're talking about the authorship question, and De Vere is one of the big contenders, and like I write in my book, for very good reasons, right? When people talk about Bacon or De Vere being the authors of the works of Shakespeare, usually what we have to go with is circumstantial evidence, and there's a pile of it on both sides. But this is the first time where suddenly we see a message that says specifically, I used the name Shakespeare. And in this work, what I did was I did a decryption of De Vere. And it's really interesting when you break down his name symbolically, which I do in my book. And again, I used evidence, cipher evidence that I discovered in a portrait of De Vere. And there are multiple portraits out there, but some of them are speculative, and we don't really know if it's him or not, right? So I went with one that is less less popular, but it actually has his name on it, labeling it as being a portrait of De Vere. And of course, it contains a bunch of cipher evidence naming the sitter as Walter Raleigh, actually. And the interesting thing here is when you look at his name symbolically, all of these masks and aliases have a symbolic element to the name itself, right? With Edward De Vere, it's really kind of cool because what it does is, if you look at it, Ed, and we know that Edward De Vere was a ward of the state, right? And he was living with Cecil, I believe, as a ward. And so Ed, when you add it up in simple cipher, adds up to 9. And the letter of, 9 is the value of the letter I in simple cipher. So we have I, ward, as a ward of the state, de, meaning from or of, and then you have Vere. A lot of people interpret that as being the root word for truth or veritas. But Vere, when you calculate its values in simple reverse and case ciphers, the simple cipher value of it is 47, which is the reverse cipher value of Mary. When you calculate it in reverse cipher, it's 53, which is the simple cipher value of Mary. Case cipher produces a value of 99, which is the value of Francis II in simple cipher. So the name Edward De Vere has within it the message, I, ward, from Mary and Francis II.
Okay.
And then when you run our alias formula on it, of course, it comes back as Walter. But, I added all of that into, along with the cipher evidence from that portrait as corroborating evidence. Now, in my book, I offer that for what it's worth. I said, well, if you think that De Vere was responsible for the works of Shakespeare,
you're right.
You could very well be right. Yeah. Because, Walter Raleigh was partially responsible for the works of Shakespeare. And so I at this point, I believe that De Vere was Raleigh. I don't say that definitively in my book. I say, here's the evidence for it. Right. You can make up your own mind. But for me personally, I find it very convincing.
Yeah. And in the picture, and correct me if I'm wrong, of De Vere, he is kind of clasping a boar, right, at the heart.
Yes, he's holding a boar that's hanging around his neck, and that in and of itself is also so. A lot of people said, have speculated, well, De Vere also had a boar in his coat of arms, and I want to say, well, why is that? Mm-hmm. And here you have him hanging. It's hanging around his neck on a ribbon. Which also brings to mind the phrase of hang hog, which comes from Merry Wives of Windsor, where, one of the characters says, well, I warrant that hang hog is Latin for bacon, I reckon, or something like that. So you actually have a hog hanging around his neck.
Yeah.
And of course, the way he was holding it too, each of the fingers, I touch upon this in my second book, or my third book, excuse me, that each of the fingers has a value. And so when we start looking at hand posture in paintings, suddenly you can actually start adding up values and calculating, see if there's a significant cipher sum, if it's the proper context. And this painting is definitely the proper context for that.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think even the Lincoln Memorial, I think the position of Abraham Lincoln's hands, right, they're symbolic of something, right? The way they're
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that is, even used today, sure.
Yeah. Okay. All right. And another famous one within the Baconian world, John Dee.
Oof. Well, this is a tough one because I always tried to stay away from it because people always said, oh, come on, Jake, John Dee had to be an alias. He had to be and so I started looking at it more closely, and what I found was in the alias transposition table that I decrypted, Dee's name appears multiple times, and it basically states that it looks like Walter and Francis were taking turns being John Dee. So here they were, very young men, and it could very well be that there was a real John Dee, and they were just using him as a mask, right?
Like William Shakespeare.
Like William Shakespeare,
yeah.
And so what they would do, of course, is practice their acting chops on acting like an old man, putting on, the makeup and the hair and everything, changing the color of the hair,
moving like an old man.
moving like an old man. Yeah. And raising their voice, talking like an older man. And so, that could very well have been what was happening at court, right? And as far as the evidence, the corroborating evidence I found, well, it was the book that has what's called the doodle of a ship. I used that and analyzed that to a great extent in the book. But for me, what was really compelling was Dee's sigil, his symbol, right? The monad. And so, when you look at that, and it says, it explains secrets of the universe, blah blah blah, like all this stuff. All you have to do is turn it on its side clockwise, and it spells out, a whole a series of numbers and letters, and when you add them up, it equals Francis. And when you do it another way, it equals Walter. So, along with the cover of his book, Manus Hieroglyphica, just the cover itself, it's just replete with cipher signatures of both guys.
Okay.
So. Again, and I offered it in my book. I say it now. I said it in my book. I said, this is not definitive. I'm just putting it out here for you to consider. You can make up your own mind of what this means, if anything. But it certainly appears to be that Francis and Walter took turns pretending to be John Dee.
Okay. And as far as there are known works, right, of Walter Raleigh, and there are known works of Francis. And then there are books where the authorship question, even of the books themselves, say there's a mystery to who the real author is. So we have the Anatomy of Melancholy. We have Don Quixote.
Yes.
So could it be possible that in the works where there is an authorship question, that these two men wrote them together, but that perhaps there was one who was maybe a more prominent author than the other?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny you bring up Melancholy, because one of the masks that Walter uses is Albrecht Dürer. Okay, now Albrecht Dürer was there are paintings and etchings that he made that predate the birth of these guys by 50 years, I think, right? But all of a sudden, you have some of these paintings that are definitely done by Walter Raleigh. For example, Melancholia 1 by Albrecht Dürer. It has the 4x4 magic square above an angel's head, which has a consonant of 34, which is the value of Watt in reverse cipher. That was one of the first things included. And then as I started looking at that etching, Melancholia 1, it's all Walter Raleigh. And if you look at the monogram of Albrecht Dürer, it has an A, but it has a crossbar at the top, making it two T's. And so there's an A and then there's a D inside of it. And when you add up these letters in the multiple cipher systems, they all come back as Walter Raleigh values. So I really started looking at that painting or that etching very quickly. So I think that he was responsible for one of the self-portraits of Dürer, where he's standing there with his hands up like this, sending a value basically of 126, which is Walter in reverse or K cipher. But also there are three etchings or carvings, engravings. One is of I think St. Jerome in his study, and then there of course is Melancholia 1, and then there is a one of the night, death, and the devil. Mm-hmm. And he was responsible for all three of those.
Raleigh.
Okay.
As Albrecht Dürer.
Yeah. But the thing is that that's not to say that all of the paintings that Dürer did back in the day are not legitimately Dürer, right? So a lot of people don't. When I say, oh, he used Dürer as a mask, people think, oh, come on, he couldn't have done all of Dürer's paintings. And that's not what I'm saying at all. What I'm saying is that he saw a really talented artist that he wanted to emulate, and he had images that he wanted to put out there. And so he's like, well, I'll just put this guy's name on it and put a different date.
I'll assume
and
the
then
name.
I'll assume the name and do it in his style. And then when you actually look at the date, and in my work, anyone who looks at my work at all, you recognize that dates are never really dates in this stuff. With the proper context, what you can do is you can just take the first two digits and add them to the second two digits, and it will produce a cipher signature of who the artist was. And sometimes there's a little twist to it, right? Sometimes the first number is not a 1, but the letter I. So you hold that back. You don't add that on.
Did you? And I'm sorry to cut you off. Did you reference this? And was it sonnet 123? It was actually
yes.
an I, a 3, and a 3.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. When you zoom in on it, it's I and a 3, or it's supposed to be a 2. Got a fly bugging me here. There's supposed to be a 1, 2, 3, and it's actually I, and then a weird shaped 3, and then another 3.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So it's something. Yeah. So that's what you're referencing. Or
yeah.
Yep. Okay.
But when it comes to dates, we have to look at the numbers as well. You look at them very closely. Sometimes they'll be tilted a little bit, and this implies a reversal. So then you have to reverse the cipher values between simple and reverse cipher in order to calculate the correct value of the signature you're looking at there. But when it comes to Dürer's work, this works exactly with Walter Raleigh.
Okay.
Yeah.
And with the J and the I, and forgive me, I forget the Orthodox history, the author of the. Well, let me take a step back. So, of the 3 major Rosicrucian works, so we have the Fraternitatis, the Confessio, and is it the Chemical Wedding of Christian Rosenkreutz?
Yes, it's the Chemical Wedding.
Okay.
Of Christian Rosenkreutz.
So what did you glean from those 3 works when it pertains to Raleigh and Bacon?
Well, what they did, and they come right out and they'd say this, and I believe it's a Confessio, they repeated it, but they say, we speak to you in parables and in symbol. And so they tell us right away that you cannot read these passages literally as if they are literal history, right? So they said, oh, our father CRC was born in 13, whatever. No. They're speaking symbolically here. And so there is a way to read them, using the cipher systems that reveals the messages, right? What I did in my book, when I looked at just the Fama Fraternitatis, I looked at it in terms of, let's see if we can figure out who the characters are, right? The characters are listed as a series of letters and not real names. So they're just initials. Well, what I discovered is that, they say that, all of these men were German except for IA, who was not. So what I did was I used the German word for brother, Bruder, which under the cipher systems, all of them, is exactly the same values as frater, the Latin word for brother. So all I did was I took the cipher values of these letters that they gave us as names, and I added them to the values of brother in each of the cipher systems. And they, right down the line, they all produce values that are either represent Francis or they represent Walter. One of them represented Drake. And last but not least, there was one that they said, and when it came to the one that was not a German, IA, I just used the English spelling of brother, and it produced, a known value. So, why German? Well, then I calculated the name with the word German, and it's 55, which is Francis Bacon in short cipher. So each of these things contains, a hidden meaning. And my favorite was the reference to the one brother who was the son of my dead father's brother, my dead father's brother's son.
Okay.
Okay. And of course, his dead father is Francis II. His brother was Charles. And all of a sudden, he had an illegitimate son named Charles Valois. And so I go and I calculate all the values for all of these, and his name ends up being the cipher value of that character. So it seems that, that the Rosy Cross could have been royal cousins. RC could stand for royal cousins just as easily, because here was his cousin, who was not legitimate, but could never, ascend the throne either. So all of these guys, it appears, had some kind of legitimate claim that would never be actualized.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that, like I said, this book, I give such a broad swath of the information and how I came to it. But when it comes to each of these individual examples, like the works of the Rosy Cross, those 3 books are going to take me an entire book to go through and explain. And same thing with the sonnets. Every chapter of this book that I've written could be a book in and of itself.
Mm-hmm.
And so now, I make all my, how I do this open source for anyone to try. And so I've been just like giving it away, saying, hey guys, pile on, I need some help.
Mm-hmm.
And so now what's really great, and I'm not revealing any inside baseball or any secrets or anything, but Will Russell and John Edwards are finishing up a book now on the 1611 King James Bible and the Baconian ciphers it contains. And I'm so excited for they won't tell me. They won't share too much with me, because they said, no, we just want to see your face when we come on your podcast and show you what we found. We want to see your face when you read the book. So I'm really excited about their material. Jason Mercer is now really delving deeply into the sonnets. So, when the time comes, maybe I'll just focus on the Rosy Cross documents, the Rosicrucian documents, and see what I can pull out of those beyond what I've already done, which I think is actually sizable.
Oh yeah, those particular 3.
Yeah.
And yeah, the Shakespeare works are filled with references to fame and to confession or confess, right? So
yes,
it's pointing to those documents.
Absolutely.
Yeah, but the trivium and the quadrivium. So the trivium would be rhetoric, logic, and grammar.
Grammar, yeah.
And then the quadrivium would be music, astronomy, mathematics, and geometry.
Geometry, yeah.
So do you believe Bacon was trying to create significant works in all those branches?
100%.
Okay.
Yeah.
That would have been his education as a young man, as a child.
Oh yeah.
7. Okay.
7 liberal arts and sciences, and of course 7 is a very significant number to him, and that's just one of the reasons why. And it's also true of modern Freemasonry, for that matter. And so that tradition runs very, very strong. And one of the things that and someone I've been I have great admiration for her work is Stephanie McPeak Peterson, and her first book, Lost Octave, I think it was called. I have it here on my shelf somewhere. But in it, she goes into this whole idea of some of the music theory, that Bacon knew. And what I've been really waiting for, I live in a college town, and some of my friends are music professors, and I've been trying to get them to kind of, hey, do you need a retirement gig? Because I want someone to dig into this to see what they could find in terms of what music did Bacon write, right? Because it's out there, it's somewhere. And I haven't gotten into any of those aliases, but when you look at all of the different kinds of areas he went into, some of my latest work, one of my latest podcasts was about the archaeoastronomy of Oak Island, and how and how Bacon basically encoded some of that into his work. for example, standing in the center of island, on the date that appears on the Shakespearean plaque, if you look east at midnight, the constellation of Delphinus is right over the horizon, like it's diving up out of the horizon, like ready to dive back down. Delphinus, of course, being a dolphin. Bacon was the Dauphin. At
France.
that exact, of France.
Yeah.
And so at that exact moment, on the other horizon, you have the constellation of Gemini halfway over the horizon looking at it, right? And in that moment, over the shoulder of Pollux in Gemini is a quarter moon in the exact same position as the quarter moon appears in the Walter Raleigh portrait.
Oh, yeah.
So you have a moon constellation correlating with that portrait. You have Delphinus on the horizon, and then at daybreak, the sun rises in the exact position where Delphinus was at midnight. So you have a moon correlation for Raleigh and Artemis, and then you have the sun association with Apollo, and therefore Bacon. And so you have all of this correlating in this one exact location, the only location where this happens, at that exact time that appears on the plaque on that date. You can't make this stuff up.
No.
Okay, that's not an accident.
Yeah, yeah. And the famous, to speak of Artemis, so the double A, a lot of people in Baconian think that's Apollo and Athena, but you're saying it's Apollo.
It's secretly Artemis, because one of the A's is always in shadow, right? And that's Raleigh. Mm-hmm. And so he's associated, he's a twin. Artemis is with Apollo's twin. Now, the Athena idea makes a lot of sense in reference to Shakespeare, right? She was the goddess of wisdom, and she would shake the spear of light in someone's face to get them to see the truth. Mm-hmm. But Apollo was also known for the same thing. So you also have a lot of archer imagery in the Shakespearean headpieces, and again, that's Artemis. So I believe it's, yes, secretly Artemis, because you have one in light, which is the sun, then you have one in shadow, which is the moon.
Okay. And again, you think the light is Francis and the dark twin. The light twin is Francis and the dark twin is Raleigh.
I believe so, yes, because it correlates to the sun and the moon. It also, on Raleigh's frontispiece of his book, History of the World, you have Bona Fama and Malfama, these angels at the top, and they're both blowing clarion horns at the top of this book cover. And one is in light, and it's good fame, Bona Fama, and then you have Malfama, which is bad fame. So you can be famous for good reasons, or you can be famous for bad reasons. And at the time of the publication, Raleigh was writing it while locked in the Tower of London, and it was not for good reasons. He was famous, but not for good reasons. Whereas at the time, Bacon was famous for very good reasons. He was one of he was James I's right-hand man here. So at the time, you have good fortune, good fame representing Bacon, and bad fame representing Raleigh. And one was in light, the other one was in shadow.
Okay. Well, and the writings themselves, and I'm gleaning this from you, is that maybe the dirtier writer was Walter. That he was a little more of the darker, dirtier writer than Francis.
He was. Yeah, and, there are a couple of the sonnets that are quite bawdy, particularly the last two, and I demonstrate how I think Raleigh was the one who wrote those, and the reasons why, because it basically he tells a story of how he married Bess Throckmorton, one of the maids of Queen Elizabeth I. That's why I think they were a later addition, because it happened after he was married.
Okay. I am definitely not a researcher. I don't think I have the patience for it, but I did attempt to, so with the essays and with the 10 in the frontispiece of the Anatomy of Melancholy, kind of trying to match up the numbers of the plaques with the corresponding essay number.
Great idea.
So, and the only thing I learned is that of studies, so the first one is a gentleman with a book referencing the Anatomy of Melancholy. Right. Gentleman Under a Tree. And so come to find out that Of Studies was Bacon's first essay. So I don't.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah, so I don't
It
know.
was, yeah.
Yeah, so I don't know if there is some correlation there. I really don't have the patience to delve into that, but somehow combining the essays and those 10 images.
That's a brilliant idea, Joe. I love it. That's a great idea.
Yeah, well, could be a dead end. Could be a dead end. Okay, so we have these two men, of course, and I think, well, let me just drop this first. And you and I have spoken of a very famous astronomer that we believe could be Bacon.
Mm-hmm.
Did you want to share that or not share that?
You know, I float ideas out there sometimes, but when it comes to actually, making a statement, I always want to have my corroborating evidence lined up. So that's why everything in the book, I just come right out and I say, yeah, I have the evidence right here, 380 pages if you want to look at it. But when it comes to, dabbling my toe into the little speculation like that, where especially a big name like that,
Hold off.
you can. No, you can go ahead and talk about it. We can throw it around, but I want to just make clear that it's like as we talk about this, we're not making any claims, right?
No,
We're just possibilities.
And definitely not me. I'm not doing it. Yeah, but just knowing Bacon's predilection for names and playing with names. So Galileo. So the first three letters: Gaul, France, I, and then Leo, lion. Of course, you've run for his lions. Stuart is king. So yeah, France, I, king. That could be a possibility. So yeah, just pure conjecture based off Bacon's predilection for playing with names.
That would be a perfect one, right? And also, you have, I mentioned Tycho Brahe earlier. That's another possibility for one of the two. But at the end of the day, there are just so many connections, right? And you look at since repetition and reproducibility are the backbone of the scientific method that he created for all intents and purposes. And if you wanted to get an idea out there and get more people to accept it and get on board, it would make sense if you had other scientists and thinkers of the day, natural philosophers, if you will, corroborating your findings and what you found. And these guys were spies. I mean, is it possible that when they made a discovery, say, what was it, the new star in the sky, and suddenly there's a supernova, and you want to talk about what you think it is, and then suddenly you could put out a writing under a different name from a different country, corroborating the observation. Seems a little underhanded, but if you really wanted to promote the scientific method and scientific ideas, and you knew you were right, like he did, then it makes sense that maybe he would do that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, you know what? I just found this. Hey, what about you, Galileo? Oh yeah, I found it too. What about you, Tycho? Why not?
Mm-hmm.
It's possible. It's possible.
Thomas Harriot. Was Thomas Harriot and
Thomas Harriot was definitely a Bacon. He was a Bacon alias. Yes.
Yeah. So, okay. So, kind of to finish up. So, I guess from what you gleaned from the ciphers, how did and we've talked about Francis. How did Walter end? So he was Peter Easton towards the end of his life, as far as Orthodox history is concerned, or as far as
okay. As far as we know,
yeah.
he was Peter Easton for quite some time, and then I'm going to throw a couple names out there as a possibility. Okay, I mentioned Arundel. He was definitely Arundel, but there's a possibility where he was also Sir William Alexander, the first Baron of Newfoundland, Nova Scotia. So, and I say that, and I know it's, again, all this stuff I say is very controversial and begs disbelief. But there's a lot of circumstantial evidence to support that. the fact that I think that he wrote the Countess of Pembroke's Arcadia under the name Sidney of Philip Sidney. And then I think as William Alexander, he decided to finish it and bridge the gap, and that's why he rewrote it as William Alexander. I think it was the same guy. But again, I don't have all of my corroborating evidence to support that, so it's speculation on my part. But I think those are just two of the names that Raleigh took. And, you know, the thing that, for me, that was incredible was when I found the message stating that they were able to fake Raleigh's execution. I think that's going to be the hardest pill for most people to swallow in this book. But when you think about it in the way I explain it in the book, it's very logical, and it would have been very simple to do. Particularly, you know, two people who were masters of stagecraft. You know, by all accounts, Raleigh's execution, it was his last great performance. He was up on stage performing. He was about to get his head chopped off, and he didn't flinch, wasn't scared at all. People found that astounding. But we also have to look at who those first-person accounts were and where they came from. At least one of them I've identified as a Francis Bacon alias. So, you know, it would have been a very simple matter for them to, as Bacon said, you know, substitute a sick slave is what he said, and that Throckmorton was in the know. And so they basically, at one point, history tells us that Raleigh invited a group of nobles down off a balcony down to the scaffold to shake hands and say goodbye. And then they were led in prayer while they were up there. So think about that opportunity. You have the guy in place that you were going to do a switch. Bacon says they hid Raleigh in a dress and a veil. So all you have to do is have a state-enforced religion, which England did, and you have to bow your head in prayer and close your eyes. Now, what more misdirection do you need to perform a magic trick than to have the entire audience bow their heads and close their eyes? Well, that's what they did. They just made the switch. And then the doomed man, who I'm sure it was told that, hey, listen, I'll take care of your family if you do this for us. You're dying anyway. You're terminally ill. You're sick. All he has to do is remember, you know, one or two lines that he has to say to the crowd. And as Raleigh predicted, he said, you know, in 20 minutes time, or a quarter of an hour's time, my ague will be upon me again. And I don't want people to think I shake in fear. And then right on cue, 20 minutes later, as he's walking, I could see the guy's, you know, hair covering his face. And he walks up and he says, you know, strike, man, strike. You know, what are you waiting for? You know, or whatever it was he said. It would have been a pretty simple matter to make the switch, but it begs disbelief, and I know that. I know that.
And we've mentioned too in the Shakespeare plays there are references to someone being switched in for execution.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I do think the play Cymbeline will have you delved into Cymbeline at all? As far as
I've read it.
Okay.
A couple of occasions. As far as actually analyzing it for this, I haven't had time.
Okay.
But yeah, I agree with you. I think you're right.
Yeah, I think Cymbeline will have a ton of information regarding those two.
Yeah, and you know, it's like I've said this a million times on my own podcast. I think I said it last time I did your show. I know I'm not the first person to ever discover this information. I really, truly believe that throughout history, because in the Rosicrucian Manifestos, it says, you know, once you become one of us and you know our secrets, you cannot say them out plainly, but you have to put them out publicly in the themes or in your artwork, you know, etc., so that people will, you know, pick up on it, that you are in the know. And I think, you know, there were so many writers in the past who did, because my background is literature and writing. So, so many writers in the past have done that. I mean, you look at Alexander Dumas, you know, has so many of the themes of what was really going on with Bacon and Raleigh. You have, you know, I'm talking about the man in the Iron Mask, even Count of Monte Cristo. You have
Robert Louis Stevenson.
100%. You also have
Alexander Pope.
Alexander Pope, or A Tale of Two Cities, Dickens.
Yeah.
You have, Sidney Carton, substituting himself because he's a lookalike, to save, the woman he loves from being heartbroken by seeing the man she loves be killed. So he substitutes himself. So you have all of these writers, and you have Edgar Allan Poe, you have Mark Twain.
Yeah.
So there were a lot of these people that were in the know and just kind of slipped it in there. Where it's like, I think enough time has passed where we're like, let's really look at the truth and see what this story really is all about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I just spelled it out.
I know you're extremely busy, but recommend Cymbeline. I think something will be fun.
Oh, definitely. It's like it's on my radar. It's on my list, but I think you're right. Your suspicions are spot on there.
Yeah. Okay. And then actually, I forgot a huge one that you mentioned in your book, Roanoke. What happened to the lost colony of Roanoke? And the word, is it Croatan?
Croatoan, and there was also the sign that basically Raleigh moved Roanoke. Okay. He dropped him off at Cooper's Cove in Nova Scotia. And the reason I said it because I found a transposition cipher encrypted within the Samuel de Champlain map of 1612, and in it says Walter say he's sorry he moved Roanoke to Cooper's Cove, moved them here to Cooper's Cove, and what people have to recognize is that Cooper's Cove wasn't really a settlement back when Roanoke disappeared. It was just a fishing stop. It was a place where fishermen would camp, and then there was no permanent settlement there until I think nearly 15 years later or something like that, going off the top of my head. And so the fact but they did know the location, and they called it Cooper's Cove. So he states that he had to move them because there was a skirmish with local natives, and because pirates put in for repairs at Roanoke, and the pirates attacked an Indian village or something like that. And so what happened was the Indians started retaliating against the colonists, and they had to get out of there. And so Raleigh just moved them. And as a sign, he was the one who carved crow into the tree or the log as his sign or seal, because you remember the Rosicrucian Manifesto, it says CR, we will use the word CR as our sign and seal. Well, what he did was he just added an O to it, because when you add it up in simple cipher, CRO adds up to 34, which is the value of Watt in reverse cipher. And of course, use the other ciphers, and it also says his name. So all he did was he knew that he could use CR, and then he just had to add the correct letter or series of letters to leave his signature. And so that's what he did.
So the remaining letters are part of his signature. After the CR.
Oh, CRO is what he left.
Yeah.
But there was also the word Croatoan.
Yeah.
Yeah, which also means something else. When you look, crow is Watt, right?
Yeah.
TO is 33 bacon. Watt is a bacon. And so, baconian.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so when we look at, and there's also other values of the word Croatoan as well, but Roanoke, what I discovered was this was the key for me discovering that a lot of the places that they named and created, they all total cipher signatures of the founder. So Roanoke, when you add up the letters in the cipher systems, all point to Raleigh.
34.
30. Well, it's also 34. It's 49.
Okay.
So he has the same number of cipher signatures that Bacon does,
depending on the cipher system.
Depending on which one, yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
So, and that's why Samuel de Champlain is credited with changing the name of Arcadia to Acadia. The reason he did that was so that the cipher values would work for Bacon's names. So Acadia in symbol cipher is 19, and that's the number of the tau, letter T in symbol cipher. But it also represents the 19th prime number, which is 67, the value of Francis in symbol cipher. So this is how they were able to incorporate them in, and you use reverse and K, and again you get more Baconian ciphers for Acadia.
Mm-hmm.
It's really pretty cool the way they did it.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, those two are unbelievable. They're minds.
Oh, Bacon had the greatest mind in the last 500 years. There's no doubt, and Raleigh was right there with him. Raleigh, didn't see himself as being of that genius caliber of Bacon, but yeah, he was also a genius. And Bacon was extraordinary.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. I think there's only one writer that exceeds him in history, Vyasa.
Really?
Yeah. The writer of the Mahabharata and the Gita within.
Oh yeah, Gita. Yeah.
And the compiler of the Vedas. To me, he is the supreme writer of the world. And maybe he reincarnated as Bacon. Who knows? Was Bacon aware of the chakras? Was he aware of the chakras in Eastern traditions?
Yeah.
He was.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, he would have come across that, especially in when he was traveling through Europe, and then later, when he was traveling with Drake, they're sailing all over the world. So, and Drake had gone to the East multiple times. So,
yeah, because when I read Shakespeare, I can tell that he knew Eastern traditions. So,
yep.
Yeah,
it's all in there. Yeah.
The story's kind of the dressing of the spiritual message, much like which really is a tradition from the East. The Mahabharata really is a book about the descent of the soul into the body and how to reascend. So the Shakespeare works are very similar.
They are, and it goes back to my friend John Edwards, his ascended master theory about Francis Bacon. And when you look at particularly the language of Fama Fraternitatis and where they traveled and what the purpose was, that whole tradition is in there for sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Yeah. You see it.
I suspected. Yep. All right. So again, please pick up The Keys of the Rosy Cross and the Ghosts of Bacon by Jake Roberts.
Double. Yeah.
Double. Yes. So yes,
Thanks,
a wonderful book. Highly recommend. Jake, well, before I let you go, are you planning on another book?
I am. Right now I'm spending the summer catching up on my reading list because I have a stack of books here I've been meaning to read, and I just started to get through those. But yeah, I have a couple more projects in the works. At some point, one thing I'm going to chip away at is just trying to do a second edition of my first book, the Holy Trinity Decryption, and I might do a revamp and a rebranding of it, and actually, call it the Hidden Autobiography of William Shakespeare. It might get a little more traction that way. And there are some, like I said, as I mentioned in the interview, there are a few items in there that I need to correct because now, the first book was really about the process that I went through as I learned how to do this. As Francis Bacon basically taught me how to do it throughout that process. And so by the end of that book, all of a sudden you see where all of the decryptions are very, very tight and clean, where I kind of honed the craft at that point. The beginning part of the book is more about the act of discovery. It's like, oh, then I saw this, and then I saw that, and it. So that was the feel that I wanted to go for with that book. But within it, obviously, there's some items that I got wrong, and I want to make sure I go through and I correct those. My second book was the treasure maps of Oak Island, the Oak Island treasure maps, and I'm pulling that from publication because, frankly, I got it wrong. And because they the team on Oak Island is aware of my information. They've looked for my knee of Hercules a few times, and it wasn't where I thought it was. It's not where I said it was in the book. So I need to correct that. So I'm not going to have that false information out there. I'm going to pull it, but I'm going to incorporate it into a new book that I'm going to be working on. This is a project that I'm kind of excited about, and I do want to establish. It's basically what it's going to be about: the role of Francis Bacon and Walter Raleigh and the Oak Island mystery, how they were involved in it. And so, like I've told my friends, I'm like, I'm not saying, they created Nolan's Cross. I'm saying that they were there, and I can place them there. And it sounds and looks as if Bacon placed his tomb there. And I'm very, very sure that that's really what a lot of this information is about. And I think that if we ever do find it, we'll probably find both of them there.
Walter and Francis.
I think so.
Okay.
I think so.
That makes sense.
And so, part of it is that, that archaeoastronomy correlation that I uncovered. I want to, make sure I encapsulate that and write that down in this book, along with all of the other map evidence I've uncovered that leads these guys directly to that place. Mm-hmm. And so I'm going to be working on that. I'm working on a project with my friend Bill Smith, the Peter Easton expert. He and I have some ideas that we're kicking around now. I just retired here as a teacher at the end of June, and he's has some crazy projects going on. And then as soon as they're done, he's going to free up some time, and he and I are going to start doing some treasure hunting.
Peter, as it pertains to Peter Easton?
Bill Smith, yeah. We're going to, well, I'll say it this way. I've located possible interesting areas of interest around the world. And, only a couple of them are in the Maritimes, which you're not allowed to treasure hunt there anyway. So that's kind of off limits. But we're going to be working on collaborating on a book soon. We're going to be putting that out there. And then hopefully we have funding for our first expedition for the first location that I want to check. And so we'll be doing that probably within the next couple of years as he wraps things up. And so it's really pretty exciting. We've been looking around. We've been talking to different producers. If someone wanted to do a possible documentary, Bill would like to see it become, like a show. We have enough information for several seasons of information, but at the end of the day, it's really going to be about us having our boots on the ground out there and seeing what we can find.
Yeah. And I just want to say, you are researching and you're trying to corroborate and validate your research. You're not just coming up with information willy-nilly. You're doing the hard work of trying to cement this.
Exactly. That's why, it's like I don't just publish when I find a decryption and the message and it comes out and it says something crazy like, oh, by the way, this is my twin brother. I'm not just saying, oh, hey, look what I found. I spent 2 years identifying corroborating evidence, from other sources other than the ciphertexts that I decrypted. And it's all there. It's all reproducible. It all repeats. This is the backbone of the scientific method. You have repeatability. It has to be there. And so now what we're going to do is we're actually going to go and put our money where our mouth is. And okay, let's go and find the real artifacts. Okay. Let's see, if we find a bunch of broken pipe stems, that's a win for me. Right. Mm-hmm. If I find a leather tobacco pouch that's 400 years old, things like that, it's still a win. If we find a box with some cool stuff inside of it, that even better.
Mm-hmm. There's evidence of human involvement at these locations.
Yeah. If the messages that I've decrypted and the locations are correct, and we go there and we find evidence that yes, indeed, they were here. That's really exciting. And like I said, I'm looking for that kind of corroboration. And it's like, I don't know if I mentioned this last time, and I think I'm allowed to share this conversation. I was talking with Rick Lagina, and so when I first arrived, he says, well, what can I do for you? What do you want, Jake? I said, I don't want anything. I said, what I would really like is just the validation that I'm right, mm-hmm. that it really is here. Mm-hmm. I said, that's all I want. Mm-hmm. And he just smiled. But really that's what it's about. I know that what I'm doing is right. I know I'm correct. And I just want to be able to prove it, mm-hmm. And the only way you do that is like if people who watch the show, The Curse of Oak Island, Rick and Marty always say, a theory is just a theory until you hold something in your hand. Mm-hmm. even though this isn't a theory that I came up with, these are, I call them discoveries. You know, I've uncovered information. I know it's true. I know it's valid. And now I'm looking for, okay, let's find, you know, actual physical proof.
Yeah. Yeah. You're following a trail. You're following a trail.
Yeah.
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 And it leads a lot of different directions, but like I said, we have a nice long laundry list of targets.
Mhm.
I'll put it that way.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, I'm sure. I am sure. Yeah. Yeah. What an amazing story. Yes, it could be a documentary, well, of what you're doing, but of Bacon and Raleigh could be a movie. I mean, it could be. It's astounding.
Well, you know, that's just it, Joe. This is one of the things that I just love about this information is that when you look at the factual information here, uh, their real history, their true story. This would make an amazing, you know, TV show or movie where you have um, everything with from the Pirates of the Caribbean to James Bond and you
Yeah.
know 007. You have Game of Thrones going on.
Yeah.
It's a combination of all of some of the best forms of entertainment we have, but it was real.
Yeah.
It was real, and that to me that is just the coolest thing. I would love to see this turn into something big. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And you're not the only one. Yeah. There are many people who want to see it. Yeah. See it popularized in some way, shape, or form.
Awesome.
Yeah. All right. Well, Jake, thank you so much.
You're very welcome, my friend.
All right. Have a great show tonight. And
Thank you.
yep. And we'll talk soon.
All right, great. Yeah, be in touch. And thanks for the big shout outs for my book. I really appreciate you. And I love your feedback. So
Well, you're welcome.
great,
Yes.
great things to think about.
Yes. Yes. And please purchase the book. All right.
Thanks.
Thanks, Jake. Bye.
Thank you.